Good morning and good evening to you all. Welcome to ICAS webinar on blue carbon and climate change. My name is Nong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China-American Studies. ICAS is an independent think tank based here in Washington, D.C., focusing on research on many of the key issues affecting or concerning the U.S.-China relations that are in need of greater mutual understanding. Allow me to say a few words on the background why ICAS launched this new program of blue carbon and climate change. Although blue carbon is an emerging and relatively understudied concept in climate change international policy discussion, it's very important to manage if greenhouse gas emissions goals are to be met. So climate change is one of the most significant challenges that humanity must face, and just as the economic and social benefit that blue carbon provides. So the potential for blue carbon ecosystem to combat climate change and provide core benefit was discussed in the 2021 Special Report on the Ocean Cryospheres in a Changing Climate. International cooperation is key to mitigating the impact of climate change. However, as we are aware, national security and economic interests limit the ability of many of the countries to come together and find a solution that benefit each other and also the global environment itself. So the Institute for China-American Studies is in a very unique position to promote research and also to encourage collaboration between American and Chinese experts, in addition to scholars from other regions. So through this program, we aim to achieve three goals. First of all, the blue carbon and climate change program. We aim to focus on the policy development with regard to developing the blue carbon economy and also combating the climate change. The second goal, through this program, we hope to establish a platform for academic exchange between experts around the world to produce policy recommendations as much as possible. And third, and most prominently, our program endeavors to find new pathways for relevant countries to meet their areas of competition in this area in order to promote mutually beneficial cooperation on climate change in the longer term. So today we're delighted to have Professor Sheng to join us at today's dialogue. Professor Wang is a senior advisor of ICAS Blue Carbon and Climate Change Program. He is the current president of the National Institute for South China Sea Studies of China. For over 20 years, Professor Wang has devoted himself in a variety of research fields, including international relations and regional strategy studies, islands development, and also Hainan Free Trade Port. His work on blue carbon has been widely circulated and quoted in many of the media. So I'm going to give the floor to Professor Wang.
Good morning, everybody. It's my great honor to meet all of you this morning. I would like to start by offering a few words to congratulate the Institute for China-American Studies for its launch of the Blue Carbon and Climate Change Program. This Institute for China-American Studies, which serves as an important bridge for engagement and mutual understanding of the Chinese and American perspective on global issues, can utilize its unique position to bring together scholars and experts across the globe and to produce original research that shapes the conversation on the burgeoning topic of the carbon, as well as many other issues related to climate change. In an effort to address global warming, Chinese President Xi Jinping has pledged to peak carbon dioxide emission between 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Many Southeast Asian countries have also announced the timeline and roadmap to achieve carbon neutrality. From this point of view, there is much room for cooperation between China and ASEAN countries with climate change. The ocean is the largest active carbon sink on Earth, roughly 20 to 50 times larger than torrential ecosystems or the atmosphere. It has the ability to absorb around 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activities and can store carbon for up to 1,000 years. China and ASEAN states all possesses an abundance of blue carbon resources, including mangroves, seagrass beds, and seaweeds. These ocean carbon sink resources serves as an essential base for the cooperation between China and ASEAN countries as they fight against climate change. Now, let me offer some thoughts on a pragmatic cooperation between China and ASEAN. First, we should build great synergy as we jointly fight against climate change and collaborate on blue carbon. We should establish mechanisms to coordinate blue carbon academy exchanges, technology and equipment demonstration, and project release. Through international conferences and forums, we could explore new methods, models, and prospects in the future development of blue carbon. Second, we should work together to enhance our discourse power in the global effort to tackle climate change. China and ASEAN countries should jointly work on expressing our concerns on global climate governance and ocean governance under the principle of equality. We should establish collaboration mechanism, development joint action plans, and implement practical ocean cooperation projects, support and understanding of the international community. Third, we should enhance cooperation to preserve and restore blue carbon ecosystems. China and ASEAN could work together on the preservation of the ocean biodiversity, the restoration of the coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass beds, coastal estuary, coastal dune, as well as the monitoring of the research of the wetland ecosystems. We should take the initiative to protect our resources advantages related to blue carbon and increase our carbon sinks. Fourth, we should actively promote the transaction of the traditional fisheries and develop carbon sink fisheries. The fishing industry is an important economic pillar for many Southeast Asian countries. In recent years, however, marine pollution, increased extreme weather events, and illegal fishing have caused inevitable damage to fishery resources. Accordingly, we should take the initiative to develop a carbon sink fishery in the context of carbon neutrality. China and Southeast Asian countries could collaborate on developing environmentally friendly and pollution-free aquaculture technology and help transition traditional fishery to carbon sink fishery. Fifth, we should further our collaboration on marine new energy. An over-reliance on coal-fired power generation has created a significant burden on the global climate. In September 2021, China pledged to cease building new coal power projects abroad. This pledge opens up new collaboration possibilities between China and ASEAN on marine new energy, given the abundant marine energy resources in many ASEAN countries. We should advance efforts in offshore wind power, ocean thermal energy, ocean wave power, and ocean tidal power to build a system of blue energy and ensure the security of lives and production. 6, we should actively contribute to the building of a global blue carbon market mechanism and enhance our carbon market bargaining power through the use of blue carbon resources. The building of such a global blue carbon market is still in the early stages. China and ASEAN countries should utilize their resources advantage in blue carbon. We should actively participate in the strategic conception and practical implementation of a global blue carbon trading market and aim for increased discourse power and bargaining power in the global blue carbon market. I would like to reiterate once again that it is a great pleasure to help introduce this timely new program led by the Institute for China-American Studies. Through their work, ICAS is sure to help bring such an important area of discussion in the climate change debate out from relatively obscurity and into the limelight where it belongs. I look forward to seeing this program take off and to further engaging a global audience on the important issues and pathways that can be explored to adapt a changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for your very kind words about ICAS' new program of blue carbon and climate change. So it's very inspiring to hear your thoughts on how to promote a China-ASEAN cooperation in this field. Now, let us turn to our distinguished panelists today to share their views on the best practice of each individual countries to incorporate blue carbon as a critical component of both their national and also global economy. We have 4 distinguished speakers at today's webinar. You will be able to read their full bio at ICAS website. Let me quickly introduce them. Dr. Quentin HANICH is Associate Professor and Fishery Governance Program Leader at Australia's National Centre for Oceans Resources and Security at University of Wollongong. Dr. Keita FURUKAWA is Affiliated Research Fellow of Ocean Policy Research Institute from Sasakawa Peace Foundation of Japan. And we have Dr. Tabitha MALLORY, is Affiliate Professor at Henry Jason School of International Study at University of Washington, and she's also the founder and the CEO of China Ocean Institute. And then we have Dr. Chen Ling. She's Associate Professor at the School of Public Policy and Management, and she's also Deputy Director of the Center for Industrial Development and Environmental Governance at Tsinghua University of China. Now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. HANICH.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to join this. It's a great initiative, and I'd like to congratulate you for that. I'm just going to share my screen and begin my presentation. Just make sure I've got this working fine. So, right. Let's make sure I got that right. Sorry about the delay. Okay, you should be now seeing a presentation. All right, so I'd like to thank you very much and really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to talk about climate change in Pacific tuna fisheries. It was interesting to hear the initiatives that you're also discussing in the context of fisheries. I hope that this is helpful for you. I've been working on the Pacific Island tuna fisheries for a couple of decades. I am based at a research center, but I've also worked for various governments and aid agencies and NGOs over the past couple of decades. So our work is very much engaged and applied in the different regional fisheries management organizations and also in the different multilateral initiatives that the Pacific Island states and other countries have also established. Hang on, sorry, just what am I doing? Okay, so when we talk about fisheries in any context, what we're really talking actually about is people. You know, we don't pretend to manage the fish don't pay any attention to us, they pay no attention to international boundaries. What we're really doing is just managing the people. And it's important to remember that when we're talking about, you know, conservation and management measures, because we need to manage these human activities and we need to manage how these activities benefit and cost and in place burdens or in place you know, governance arrangements on all of us. So when we design these management arrangements, we're always thinking about the people who they're impacting on. We also must remember that when we are designing these types of management arrangements, we are designing it in a system of nation states. That's fairly bleeding obvious a lot of the time, but it's also important to remember that fisheries are activities by people and by industry. Nation states don't fish, but it's the nation states that are bound by the international legal frameworks, and it's the nation states that implement, you know, the measures at the domestic level. So we negotiate these international agreements between nation states, and then the nation states then go off and implement those measures on the actual people who do the fishing. And I've always loved a quote from Ambassador Alvaro Pardo from the 1960s. "We live in a system of sovereign states, jealous of their powers. This is quite basic, even though the system itself is obsolescent." That is still the system that we live within, and that's our international system. It hasn't really changed too much despite all of the changes that have occurred in industry, our economies, globalization, and everything else that's gone with it. And then when we think about climate change, we're looking at the impacts of climate change on, particularly in this context, on Pacific small island developing states. And these impacts of climate change on these fisheries raise fundamental equity and climate justice questions that have global significance. We're talking about the world's biggest tuna fishery in the world's biggest ocean and a number of states that depend very, very heavily on those fisheries. The Pacific Island states was one of the leading groups during the previous round of negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals. And thanks to the Pacific Initiative, we also saw a new development goal that focused explicitly on oceans, so SDG 14. That aims to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas and marine resources for sustainable development. It included a number of indicators, but the important one in this context is number 7, which is also about increasing benefits to small island developing states. We obviously also have the SDG on climate change. And the first one, obviously, is about strengthening the resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters. How can we improve the resilience and adaptive capacity, particularly, again, for small and developing states in the context of climate change? So when we talk about climate change and we talk about fisheries, particularly when we're talking about these transboundary fisheries like tuna, everything is in the context of a United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That was signed in 1982. It's widely regarded as the Constitution for the Oceans. It describes a number of key principles for ocean conservation and management, the rights and duties of states. It implements a zone-based management approach by spatially dividing up the oceans into high seas, exclusive economic zones, archipelagic waters, and territorial seas. The successful negotiation of the Law of the Sea is widely considered also to be a highlight of international political history and cooperation. And at its adoption, it was suggested that the property rights that were granted to coastal states would resolve many of the open access problems that were then undermining sustainable management. This is important, particularly in the context of the Pacific, because it quite fundamentally changes our framework for how we manage these transboundary fisheries, but also who owns these transboundary tuna fisheries. So what we have here is a map of the Pacific Ocean, almost half of the planet's surface, largest ocean in the world. And if you look at it from a traditional territorial view or terrestrial view or continental view, it looks like a whole bunch of nothing. It's just a whole bunch of blue. And the countries in that space are so small that they're almost impossible to see on such a map. For example, Kiribati, in this context, is one of the smallest countries in the world, 33 tiny atolls, a land surface area of just over 800 square kilometers. For anyone who's been to Kiribati, it's pretty clear that there is not much land and you can see ocean at all times. But following the law of the sea, things changed. So the law of the sea established these exclusive economic zones, and Kiribati goes from being one of the smallest countries in the world to being the 12th largest country in the world with a very, very large exclusive economic zone of roughly 3.5 million square kilometers. This is important because a lot of the world's biggest tuna fisheries are taken from waters under national jurisdiction. 87% of catch from the entire Western Central Pacific comes from waters under national jurisdiction, and almost 60% from the Pacific Island waters alone. In a good year, Kiribati accounts for roughly about 12% of the global catch of tuna. So to put that in context, a small undeveloping state becomes very, very important for tuna. During the 1990s, however, it became clear that the law of the sea wasn't yet strong enough and detailed enough to resolve many of the concerns that we had around overfishing, unregulated fishing, and other issues. So in the early 1990s, we saw the development of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement that started to try to put more detail on how states would cooperate. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that at the moment, given the lack of time, but suffice to say, this was a big achievement, and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement really is something to be proud of. It's a big success in terms of how it further articulates these duties to cooperate. One of the things that it really did, which was very important, was to give special consideration to the special requirements of developing states. It includes quite a fair bit of language on how it does that, but the point I want to focus on here is that when states are cooperating to manage stocks like tuna, they need to ensure that conservation and management measures do not result in transferring, directly or indirectly, a disproportionate burden of conservation onto developing states. Doesn't apply to developed states, it's applying to developing states. It means that developing states that are still trying to develop their own industries and economies and et cetera, shouldn't be inequitably burdened by conservation measures for overfishing, for example, that wasn't caused by them in the first place. It allows their economic development, gives them required special consideration. So in this context, we see the Pacific Islands being very, very proactive. Over the past 40 years, the Pacific Island states have established some of the world's most sophisticated and advanced regional cooperative tools, including the Pacific Island Foreign Fisheries Agency, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, the parties to the Inaugural Agreement. And these organizations have established some of the world's leading management frameworks to cooperate in how they manage their fisheries and how they co-develop these fisheries within their exclusive economic zones. Simultaneously, during the late 1990s, the Pacific Islands also led the negotiation of the first regional fisheries management organization that would actually address these fisheries. So the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission is the relevant RFMO, and that is responsible for developing cooperative management across both the EEZs and the high seas. It includes all of the key fishing states, both the distant water fishing states, as well as the key coastal states. This is important because these fisheries are fundamentally important to these Pacific Island small states. The access fees from foreign vessels that are licensed to fish within these waters, as well as the increase in domestic fleets, contributes incredibly important revenue to these governments. You know, for example, Kiribati, the access fees can contribute up to about 70% of government revenue. So it's fundamentally important that these fisheries continue in a long-term sustainable manner in order to fund the economies and these services in these countries. It's also important because the lagoon fisheries, the inshore fisheries, the coastal fisheries are under increasing pressure from a variety of different problems, whether that be population challenges, climate change impacts, pollution, overfishing. So we really do need to see that not only do we need to better manage these coastal and inshore fisheries, but the reality of the population pressures and the climate change pressures on those fisheries means that we need to look for alternatives. So these offshore tuna fisheries also become very, very important for this economic development, livelihoods, and food security for these states. The complication, of course, is climate change and the transboundary nature. The migratory tuna are already significantly impacted by highly variable ENSO patterns. So it's the normal practice at the moment to see these fisheries be highly variable, shifting across thousands of kilometers from the Central Pacific to the Western Pacific and back again. And when that happens, you will see changes in fishing productivity and fishing effort within these exclusive economic zones. And this is further exacerbated now by climate change. Last year, we were fortunate to participate and collaborate with a group of co-authors from across the Pacific that included a bunch of very, very smart people, much smarter than me, who did a lot of modeling, used all the latest data, and basically modeled what the forecast impacts of climate change would be on these fisheries, and then what the impacts of those changes would be on the revenue in the Pacific Island countries. And unfortunately, we found that there were substantial impacts, not just on the coastal fisheries, but also on these oceanic tuna fisheries. And that could result in significant declines in particularly the purse seine fisheries inside the EEZs of up to 20%, and that would lead to significant losses in many of these Pacific Island states that are highly dependent on these fisheries. This is just a quick illustration of the changes. I don't want to go into detail right now, but what we basically see is a shift of the main fishing grounds from the Western Pacific more and more into the Central Pacific and further across. And that largely takes them, well, that partly takes them from waters where they were mostly inside exclusive economic zones into waters where they're now more in the high seas. And that will have an impact on the Pacific Island states and their revenue-dependent economies. So what we then calculated based on the modeling was an assessment of how this might impact under different scenarios. And we used the RCP 8.5 and the RCP 4.5 scenarios to do the modeling. And that generated in these slides, as you can see, how it would impact on different states and what that would then do to the fisheries that occur in their exclusive economic zones. So in this context, and also in the context of broader climate change impacts on the Pacific Island states, we've seen very proactive dialogues and initiatives by the Pacific Island leaders who have committed to collective efforts, including to support the further development of international law, with the aim of ensuring, for example, that maritime boundaries and baselines are continued and cannot be challenged, and that the Pacific Island states will continue to advocate various forms in international arena to ensure that they don't end up paying an unfair price for the climate change caused by developed states. At the same time, we also have this issue of the climate change impacts on the fisheries and how we can then address that through the relevant regional fisheries management organization. At the moment, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission has a range of conservation and management measures that apply to these stocks, but they currently depend on exemptions for many of the Pacific Island states because we've not yet been able to reach agreement on equitable limits. These exemptions weaken the effectiveness of these measures. So we really do need to actually negotiate equitable limits and allocations in order to develop, a really proper, effective management framework for these fisheries. And again, in the context of climate change, it's another factor that we have to consider. So in 2019, at the last WCPFC, before COVID, we were still able to meet face-to-face, we adopted a resolution on climate change that resolved to consider these climate change impacts on tuna fisheries and any other related impacts, particularly on small island developing states. This year, we'll be continuing with existing conservation and management arrangements, but we'll also be focusing on allocation negotiations to address some of the allocation and limits for the high seas fisheries particularly. These negotiations will need to be consistent with the international legal framework, and we'll have to ensure the long-term conservation of these resources. But importantly, we'll also have to ensure that these management frameworks consider these special requirements of the small island developing states and their respective dependence on the fisheries resources, particularly again, these Pacific Island, small island developing states. In the context of climate change, we are already seeing some of these impacts start to apply. So by agreeing on allocation and by agreeing on limits, we can significantly mitigate the projected declines of the Pacific Island EEZ fisheries and avoid exacerbating climate injustice. Interestingly, in WCPSC in 2019, during some of these conversations, the Korean delegation made an interesting point, which was that they needed to have access to the high seas fisheries, and they could see that they would probably need to have increased access to the high seas fisheries in the context of the changing fisheries. But they were suggesting perhaps we could explore the possibility of making the EEZ vessel days that were licensed from the coastal states transferable to the high seas, so that the present day conditions when the fish stocks were abundant in the EEZs, and as things change, that the new management frameworks would not jeopardize the sovereign rights or aspirations of the Pacific Island states. So there was a beginning of a discussion about how distant water fishing states and coastal states could cooperate to effectively lock in the current distributions of fisheries resources, so that the coastal states would continue their benefit from these resources without losing benefits in future as these fisheries changed. By doing so, we would then avoid further climate injustice and further inequitable impacts on the Pacific Island states. So what we basically started thinking about was how to lay the foundation for enabling distant water fishing fleets to continue paying revenue to the coastal states for access to their EEZs, but in certain circumstances to also be able to use that license to then fish on the high seas if the catch rates were better there. It was an example of a possible equitable solution. We still have not made much progress on that yet. We're still wondering how to do this, but this is going to be a key issue for the future for the Pacific Island fisheries as we wonder about climate change impacts on these fisheries, and also in the context of blue carbon, noting the comment at the introduction about how blue carbon fisheries can also be developed and managed. We will need these international frameworks. Lots of questions, but I will leave it there for the moment, and then I look forward to a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanich. Thank you for sharing your research on how climate change and also tuna impact each other, particularly in small islands developing states. Now, I would like to hear your thoughts later during discussion on the connection of fishing activity and the blue carbon. And we're going to leave the question after all the presentation. Now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Keita Furukawa to share your experience on the Japanese practice.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nong for kind introduction, and thank you again for ICAS for hosting and inviting us for this important event. I also would like to thank everyone's hard work to this event happen. With saying this, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all respective participants. So let me share my screen. Here, we already have a elaborated presentation about the sustainable fisheries under the climate change situation, especially for the Pacific small island developing states with a large and deep ocean. Here, I would like to introduce characteristics, understanding, institutionalization, and public participation of the blue carbon activities near the coast in Japan. So our Japan is located in the northeast end of Asia and open to Pacific Ocean, and sharing one of the most vulnerable and high biodiversity sea of East Asia. We are surrounded by the warm water current from south and cold water current from north, and stretched from subarctic to subtropic region from north to south. Then the different types of the seagrasses, seaweeds, and sea kelps are found along the coast. Recent studies counted about 21 different types of the habitat classification were found in our country, and it covers more than 1,800 square kilometers in total. So it is natural to us Japanese living with such wealth of the sea, especially coastal communities. For example, in Tokyo Bay, sitting in the middle of the Japan island coast, just 100 years ago, the bay was surrounded by the tidal flats, and many seagrasses meadows are seen. On the seagrass bed, the local fisherman operating sailing trawler, we call it the utasebune, to troll net gently by wind power, just to catch shrimps or fish and conserving the seagrasses. Another activity related on blue carbon ecosystem is nori mariculture on the surface. The black paper looks like using in the sushi. And it covers 5.8 square kilometers of the sea surface in Tokyo area even in the maximum. And not only the carbon, but also the nutrients are absorbed by these blue carbon ecosystems. It helps a healthy nutrient cycle in the bay. Here, we have to clarify the difference between the green carbon and blue carbon. The green carbon stands for that carbon sequestrated in biomass of the wood, while the blue carbon represent the carbon sequestrated in the ocean-based ecosystem. In the marine environment, water body transport and high digestion capacity makes carbon cycle very dynamic. For example, the first, we have to thinking about the photosynthesis trapping mechanism of the CO2 and stock carbon in the body of the seagrasses. And second, the transported particulate carbon has been trapped on the bottom. But this carbon has been released as a dissolved matter because of the digestion of the organic matter. While in such process, our scientists found that the refractory carbon, so-called remaining matter here in short, can be happening in the about 10% of the matter in the some cases. And it can be a sequestrated carbon. So we call it as a blue carbon for this one. It means as long as we have a production or growth of the seagrasses, the remaining carbon is sequestrated continuously. So in Japanese government, we are pushing blue carbon ecosystem restoration, conservation, and creation as the climate change mitigation measures. Since Japanese government made a declaration for achievement net zero carbon emission society enabling until the 2050, Port Bureau of the Ministry of Land Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism is focusing on co-benefit of the restoration of the blue carbon ecosystem through construction works, while the fishery agency put focus on conservation and aquaculture of seagrasses, seaweeds, and kelp bed. Governments cooperated with academia to specify how we can determine the carbon sequestration by blue carbon ecosystem in simple and consistent way. So sequestrated carbon can be used for carbon offset, as you know. The private company to fulfill their set commitment of the carbon emission by using this kind of offset mechanisms. In these processes, publicness and neutrality for authentication is very, very important. In Japan, we established the Japan Blue Economy Association to enhance and accelerate this kind of marketing implementation. It is still preliminary phase. And in 2021, they gave certification to the carbon credit in 4 sites in Japan, in total of the 80 tons of the CO2 by blue carbon. So, who makes a blue carbon credit? In Japan, historically, the blue carbon legislation work has been led by the citizen voluntary activities. In Kanazawa Hake in Tokyo Bay, eelgrass planting has been conducted by a Meta NPO group. The many NPOs and the citizens gathered and keep consistency and sustainability of the action associated with life cycle of the eelgrass. So this figure shows the seeding transplanting in the spring rain season. Such continual effort for blue carbon ecosystem restoration, massive restoration, even works has been done, and the scenery we want comes true. One of the secrets to success is a flexible and adaptive network of the stakeholders. It is including the citizens, researchers, governments, private, and fisheries. And the other one is ecosystem-based management of the action. Or if you like, you can say this is a science-based action. Once blue carbon market established, our NPO type blue carbon legislation can be a creation side of the as a contributor. Nevertheless, to get certificate of the blue carbon credit, we have to prove how much carbon can be sequestrated by our activities. One of the important things to do is quantify the biomass of the seagrasses and translate to the production and remaining matter, that is blue carbon, by using set coefficients from the government and a collaboration with the academia. So it is a highly technical and scientific activities we have to do. The other example in the Yokohama area, wakame seaweed have been cultivated as a workshop style event. It is already comes in 21st workshops in this year. It means we have experienced 21 years on this. We're recruiting public participants for 250, and operation has been done with more than 90 staffs. You see the raft was made by ourselves and throw into the Yokohama port area, and the seedlings attached to the main rope, and the rope was hanging down to the raft. The good collaboration with the citizens and the divers and some stakeholders are really, really important for doing this. And this year we get more than 1.3 tons of the wet weight of the wakame seaweed after the cultivation of the 2 months. It is equivalent to the 1.2 tons of CO2. Then the Yokohama City office gave the certification of the carbon credit, not only the direct carbon sequestration, but also energy saving effect by these activities. The created credit has been used for the carbon offset in the event in the Yokohama City. So with this, as seen by this example, we have to make good link between the global agenda and local action. And we are expecting Blue Carbon and Climate Change Program in ICAS highlights the blue carbon ecosystem as a base of the achievement of SDGs, mitigation of the climate change, and conservation of the biodiversity, which is foundation for the sustainable development. And also expecting to put emphasis on the blue carbon ecosystem conservation and restoration with co-benefit to people's prosperity. With this, I thank you for your attention. Back to you, Dr. Nong. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Furukawa. I really learned a lot. It's very impressive. I think Japan has done a lot in terms of research on blue carbon, also in terms of a lot of government regulation and practice from the national and to a local government. And also thank you for words and about our presentation with on our new blue carbon and climate change program. We look forward to working with you in the future. Now I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Tabitha MALLORY and to hear your thoughts about what Americans' views or perspective on blue carbon and climate change. Tabitha, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nong. So first, I want to also say congratulations to the Institute for China America Studies on the launch of this program, the Blue Carbon and Climate Change Program. And also thanks to President Wang for having me and for your remarks, and to Nong and her staff like Matt, who've been really great. So greetings from Hawaii. I'm actually in Hawaii right now. I don't live here. I live in Seattle, but I'm here for the Association for Asian Studies. And it's kind of a nice place to be, though, kind of in the middle of the ocean. A lot of my work actually has to do with fisheries. So Quentin's presentation, it was, it's kind of my world. And of course, Hawaii is not a Pacific Island nation, but it's Polynesian, and the United States is members of the WCPFC by virtue of Hawaii. So we have a big tuna fishery here. So even though I work more on fisheries, my remarks today are going to be more like Furukawa-san's presentation. I haven't done a lot of work on blue carbon, but I was very interested in what the U.S. Is doing and thinking about blue carbon. So I approached this from kind of a narrower perspective, talking about the carbon sequestration in wetland areas like mangrove, seagrasses, and tidal marshes, salt marshes. Although I think it's great that the program itself is going to be covering the intersection of ocean and climate change more broadly. So I thought I would start from the very beginning, actually quite literally for me. I'm going to pull up some slides here. I don't really have a formal presentation, just some kind of graphics to show you. So I grew up in Miami. And so when I think about, things like mangroves, which the science tells us really has the capacity to sequester carbon more than really any other resource, including the seagrass and tidal flats, and then especially compared to a lot of the land-based sinks, mangroves are kind of the best. And so I thought back to my childhood, growing up, along the Florida coast with all these mangroves, and they're just a really beautiful species. They're pretty fascinating. They're kind of unusual. They're kind of a cross between, and there's a lot of different species of them, but they're a cross between a tree and a shrub. And they live they're one of the, I think maybe the only, set of species that actually can live in salt water or brackish water, which is a combination of salt and fresh water. The painting on the left is from a South Florida artist. I actually have this painting on my wall at home. And he has done a lot of work in South Florida on, ecosystem, and really kind of bringing, art together with conservation, which I think is great. So I grew up, kayaking through areas like you see right there. This is some mangroves in Key West. And in addition to providing carbon sequestration, they also provide habitat for animals like manatees, which eat them. And then they also ring this huge wetland area called the Everglades. So here's the Everglades. My parents really do literally live like right around here, kind of near this Biscayne Park. So the Everglades is a very unusual wetland system. It's the only one of its kind in the world. It's a subtropical wetland system. It's about 2,800 square miles or 7,250 kilometers big, so pretty big. It's the third largest national park in the United States, in the contiguous United States, the 48 states. And it's now only about half the size that it used to be. So there's this little lake, or big lake, you can kind of see the tip here. the Everglades really used to extend from this lake and a river above that all the way down to the tip of Florida. And over the years, about half of it has been lost because of really development projects that have drained the wetlands and created these kind of concrete islands on which humans built habitation. So right now, the Everglades is undergoing the world's largest ecosystem restoration project. It's called the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This was launched in 2000 by the US Congress. And it's going to be an estimated $8.2 billion to restore it. And originally it was estimated to take probably 30 years, but more recent estimates are putting it at way above that cost, probably a few $1 billion more, and probably going to take more like 50 years if it's even successful. And so I think it's a great starting point because when we're thinking about these blue carbon demonstration sites around the world, and Furukawa-san, he went over, I think, a lot of really great examples from Japan. I think it's important to remember that all of these areas really are kind of localized, and the solutions for them have to be locally determined, but it doesn't mean that we can't have some good ideas, by kind of sharing these examples, and also, just an understanding of a lot of the challenges that, we're going to be facing for a lot of these types of areas. And so some of the challenges for the Everglades are pretty huge. There are a lot of them. What's happening is there's the Everglades area, and it's kind of ringed on the outside by the mangroves, and the water table under Florida is sinking, like it is in a lot of places around the world because of the demand for fresh water. And also sea levels are rising. And so you're having more seawater entering into the Everglades, which is fresh water. And the mangroves, these species of mangroves that are in Florida live in brackish water. And so their habitat is changing because the water is becoming more salty. So that's damaging to the mangroves. And then there are a bunch of other problems. So what happened was here, let's see, let me show you so this is what the Everglades looks like. There's been a lot of success. So there's at the bottom of the screen, there's an alligator. So when I was growing up, the Florida alligators were on the endangered species list. And now they've pretty much completely recovered, and then some, to the point where people have to be careful of their small pets because there are a lot of them get eaten by alligators. I mean, they're all over Florida now. So that's a really great success story. But one of the things that has happened is, as I mentioned before, in order to build houses in this area, people created a lot of canals, which is really detrimental to the region, because you essentially stop the natural kind of meandering water flow, and it becomes much more direct. So you lose some fresh water that way too. And so this is what they look like. This is literally my mother's backyard. And there's a lot of these canals in South Florida, and it looks like a great place, but it's just really horrible for the environment. And so when we're thinking about restoring, an area like this, you can't uproot, essentially millions of people to put it back the way it was before. So that's one of the really big challenges. South Florida also has challenges with regard to, pollution entering this water, both kind of like chemical pollution and also nitrates from agriculture. A lot of the Everglades was replaced with agricultural lands, a lot of them to produce sugar. And so, just like some places in China and other parts of the world, there are a lot of algae blooms because of that agricultural runoff. And then another challenge is invasive species. That also changes the ecosystem here. So I think a lot of people may have heard in the news about Florida's freezing iguanas. If they are, below a certain temperature, these iguanas will just kind of get paralyzed. They're not dead. They just freeze because they're, cold-blooded species, and they just kind of plop on the ground. You just see these huge iguanas all over the place. And it's really funny and interesting, But these are not native species. Any native Florida species does not freeze when it's this cold, because Florida is subtropical, it's not actually tropical. And so, the species that are originally from Florida have evolved to be able to endure some freezing temperatures. So these are generally from Central America. People bring them in as pets and then they escape or they're released into the wild. So it'll be interesting to, there's a lot of, I think, really great ideas and projects that we're seeing through this restoration project. Like one of them is using wetlands areas, kind of recreating new wetlands areas to filter water, kind of create a natural filtration system for pollution, which is looking promising. But there are going to be a lot of challenges remaining for this. And I think, discussing and comparing ideas, to handle these, I think is a really important thing to do. Thinking about US blue carbon initiatives more broadly, I was kind of looking into what there is. And so far, it seems like it's a little bit less organized than Japan's example, at least from what I gathered in the previous presentation. It's been a lot more of an ad hoc approach. The agencies that have been involved are the US Geological Survey, which is part of the Department of Interior, NOAA, which is our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and a lot of these work together. There's also this Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is kind of a consortium that brings together a lot of the players. There is an NGO, Restore America's Estuaries, which brings a lot of local organizations together to work together. And there are a lot of universities that are involved in a lot of these initiatives. So where I normally am in Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, they have actually done a lot of great work. So the picture on the right side of the screen shows kind of some of the areas where they've been exploring, kind of gathering data and doing some demonstration sites for blue carbon sequestration. They seem to be one of the more organized groups of people. And so there has been an attempt to make this a bit more comprehensive and purposeful. There have been a few attempts to introduce a bill or to create a law by introducing a bill through our US Congress. So the second attempt was just last fall, this Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act. And so if that were passed, fingers crossed, it doesn't look that promising. But if that were passed, it would create a working group on blue carbon for the US and just really create a more comprehensive approach, have a national map of some of these coastal blue carbon ecosystems, create a national strategy for them, provide some funding to do research and monitoring and data gathering. So one of the challenges is that it really does require a lot of data, in order to manage these, and also especially to connect these initiatives to programs like carbon finance opportunities. You really have to have, Furukawa-san was talking a little bit about this too, to make that kind of transparent and reliable. One of the challenges is having enough data to really be able to implement a program like that. So we will see. I also put a couple, I'll share these slides with ICAS after. I also included a couple of international initiatives that I thought were really great for people who want to have a better understanding of blue carbon. And then here, I've got a couple of maps here kind of showing where some of these areas are. So of course, the US has a very big coastline. So there's lots of potential. This is the one that came from USGS, and then also NOAA has one as well for some sites, but it's not very organized. There's a lot of players in all these projects. And then in terms of kind of the state level performance for data, it's kind of a wide variety. Massachusetts and Oregon were the ones that had the most data and ability to gather data. And in general, the West Coast overall was kind of better situated than the East Coast in the United States, but still some work to do. And so I thought I'd come back kind of towards the end here, come back full circle to mangroves. So I know China has done a lot of work on mangroves as well. And the year before the pandemic, I was I had the opportunity to visit the Guangxi Autonomous Region, their Center for Mangrove Conservation, and also see some of the efforts to restore the mangroves there, which you can see in the pictures on the left. There's the center on the right. And so, I think both the US and China, as well as, really all the other countries, coastal countries, at least in the world, are going to be grappling with these issues. And so I'm, again, really looking forward to the launch of this forum as a way to approach these issues and, kind of thinking beyond, just the blue carbon, the way I've presented it here, just to kind of echo President Wang's words earlier, there are so many other areas in which we can cooperate and get ideas from each other. I mean, we will also need to have initiatives that address these kinds of issues on the high seas. BB&J negotiations are going on. They were not as successful as I think everybody had hoped in the last round that just completed recently. And I think there's a lot of interesting things that China is doing in terms of aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture that the US could learn from. We don't have a very large aquaculture industry here. Other things like integrated coastal management. So I'll just conclude by saying that I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Tabitha, for telling us your Florida mango. The Hainan, we also have a lot of mango. Hopefully, when the pandemic is finally over and we can host you in Hainan mango. And thank you for sharing with us Americans' initiative on blue carbon. And I'm looking forward to further exploring opportunity for cooperation on these areas. Now I'm going to give the floor to our last speaker, Dr. Chen Ling, to share your experience on Chinese perspective and practice.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hong, to invite me here to be with you, and also congratulations for launching such a great project. Let me share my screen. Here is it. Okay. Yeah. So actually, the previous speakers also talked about lots about our opportunities and scientific facts and the way we can solve those problems. And I think I could just briefly go away. About those facts and conditions. So first, we can take a very quick look about the blue opportunities that blue carbon provided, and we already know that as human activities are causing global temperature to rise. So it's kind of data from NASA and IPCC, and so I think here in this panel, our speakers may quite sure about that. And for to achieve carbon neutral, there's kind of issue about carbon balance to balance the carbon source and the carbon sink. So basically, there's two ways to achieve that carbon neutral. One is to reduce the carbon emission, and the other ways to increase the carbon sink. So there's kind of two different mechanisms to increase those carbon sink. We already have like 4 carbon pores, including land carbon pore, atmosphere, marine, and lithosphere. So it seems that the marine carbon pore is the biggest one, and so that's why we are here talking about the carbon, blue carbon, and we believe that it's a kind of major scenario to for emission reduction and sink enhancement. So actually, as a fact, the role of ocean in climate change has been recognized long ago. In 2008 report of UNEP, this report already highlights the critical role of the Earth's ocean. And just in last month, the IPCC's working group 2 has released their assessment report. It's actually devotes the whole chapter to the ocean and the coastal ecosystem, and also talk about their services in the climate change. And I think the good news is we have at least lots of three maybe blue carbon resources like mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass beds. The good news is at least 151 countries worldwide has at least one blue carbon resource, and 71 countries have 3 of them. And it's provide a very good foundation for international cooperation. But the bad news is at least like 20 to 50% of those blue carbon resources has been damaged or just being degraded. And those degraded blue carbon ecosystem actually release 1 billion tons of carbon dioxides per year. To restore those blue carbon resource could provide like 14% reduction potential to control our planet's temperature. And so that's kind of a great opportunity for international cooperations. And so far, there are lots of existing mechanisms for blue carbon cooperation. And so one is the blue carbon initiative that like previous speaker also mentioned that, which is launched in 2010 by Australia or by UNESCO and other organizations. And the second is IPCP, International Blue Carbon Partnership, which is launched by Australia government in 2015. And the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road Blue Carbon Initiative, which is initiated by Chinese government in 2017. And also high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy launched by 40 countries in 2018. So there are many kind of existing mechanisms, but still there are sort of remained issues need to be discussed and solved. So I think basically there are not questions about here, but at least those 3 remaining issues are important. So one is how to integrate those international cooperations into existing policies and financing process. And the second is how to provide support for countries which are seeking to promote and remain those climate benefit of our blue carbon resource. And the third is how to introduce market mechanisms to those to obtain additional financial support to secure blue carbon conservation and restoration efforts. So we know we already have sort of green carbon development mechanisms like CDM, like REDD, and so on. But we do need a blue carbon development mechanism to promote blue carbon ecosystem. But how? And here I'd like to introduce some Chinese practice and progress. China actually have great potential for blue carbon sink. We have quite good natural conditions in terms of long coastline and suitable climate conditions and very diversified climate structure. And the second, we also have sort of blue carbon habitats at coastal zone, including mangroves, seagrass beds, and salt marshes. And there are lots of mariculture area in the coastal zone also. Most of them are shellfish agriculture, but also fisheries, of course. And here are some policies and progress in China. in China's policy processes, like in the top level, our CPC Central Committee launch sort of ideas and comments or decisions on blue carbon policy or strategy, and then our state council will follow with some national plan, and then there both CPC and state councils top level documents are very strong incentives or signals to local governments and business. So since 27, our top level governments released a lot of policies in terms of climate change or ocean economy or marine in the marine economy. And in recent years, those top level documents are more focused on the wetlands and also blue carbon ecosystems, especially in Hainan province. Introduced by President Wang Sheng, that the blue carbon economy was just launched and encouraged in the entire Iceland. And those and in terms of the business sector, we do have sort of blue carbon industry, but basically they are fisheries and aquacultures, and now we have sort of practices and also accumulate lots of expertise in some, deep sea aquaculture and some artificial upwelling technology. But still, as I mentioned, it's focused on fishery and agriculture. So it's not so related with those mangroves or seaweeds or those blue carbon resource. And I think if we'd like to include more blue carbon resource into market mechanism, we need to, we actually face lots of problems like a shortage of fundings and the trade-off between the ecological and economic interests. And the third is like conflicts between conservation and the livelihoods. Here's some pictures. Here is actually the mangroves, but also the local people would like to feed ducks here, and so the mangroves degraded, So it seems that we can see poor actual results of conservation and restoration projects. I think the true solution will lie on some deep mechanisms, like to capitalize the value for marine ecological resource, and to build a suitable value conversion mechanism to convert those ecosystem value to a market value. So I would like to propose two major solutions for blue carbon governance. One is to close the loop for capitalize the blue carbon resource, so we can explore the value-added investment potential for blue carbon resource, and also use it to improve the livelihoods for communities. And the second solution would be to build blue carbon markets, as Professor FURUKAWA mentioned before. I think it's very important to establish a continued foundation for blue carbon. So let me a little bit specify these two solutions. For those capitalization loop, I think first we already have sort of natural resource like mangroves and seaweeds and so on, but need to evaluate their ecological and economical value, and then define the property rights to some certain community or a business or individuals. Then those natural resources are now transformed as natural assets. Those assets could be, could deliver sort of products and service, which can be tradable on the market. Then those eco products and service again should be converted or capitalized into eco capital, which, for example, like shares and options and credits. Those eco capitals could be tradable in the capital market, and so we can, stimulate more investment, not only in the local communities or local business, but worldwide. And then the benefit from the capital market again finance the nature resource. So that could be a complete loop for capitalization of blue carbon resource. And the second solution is to build a blue carbon market. We propose lots of market trading mechanisms here. So we at least have two basis trading mechanisms. One is carbon-based transaction, and there's non-carbon-based transaction. The yellow ones are already existing mechanisms like a voluntary market. So we have like a VCE, like carbon credits tradable, and but not so far. The blue carbon credits are not integrated into the obligatory market, and then we also, to expand those carbon credits to more inclusive markets, to different communities. And there are also lots of non-carbon based transactions. Basically, it's based on the capital market. And for example, the international climate funding mechanisms or green finance service innovation. So those are non-carbon trading mechanism. And besides this, we can also, promote some like new business model, for example, to defining property rights to local communities, or those some business or industry developments like eco-friendly traveling or sort of things. So as a conclusion, I think now there are sort of urgent agendas for future blue carbon market, and so one is to set up a accounting and evaluation system, and that could determine whether the value is real and reliable and will serve as a new driving force for growth. And the second, we need to encourage the ecological technology progress, and that's expand into the factors of production, including natural capital transformed and so on. And the third is to facilitate market mechanism, as I mentioned before. I think I run up my time, and I close here. Thank you, Professor Hong.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen-Ling. I think that's a very, very comprehensive explanation on the existing international cooperation mechanism and the Chinese practice and policy and program. And thanks for bringing up these two proposed solutions. I'm sure we really learned a lot. And we still have some minute for Q&A. I am not going to make any comments, so I'm going to read the question in the Q&A box. I think the first question is to Dr. Hanich. It's a question from a PhD student of Nankai University. The question is whether the generally accepted international rules or coastal states' domestic intended contribution could better address these climate change and blue carbon issues. That's a question for you.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure that I actually fully understand the question, but the nature of the transboundary fisheries, particularly the climate change impacts on those fisheries, will require an international cooperative response. Otherwise, if it could be handled domestically, then it would be handled domestically. So when it's in the context of these transboundary issues, just like the inherent nature of climate change, we require cooperative responses. And I guess the only questions there is then we probably also require responses that are implemented both through the regional fisheries management organizations. But if the RFMO doesn't actually adequately address the problem or equitably address the problem, then there's also an argument for climate justice avenues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hanich. The second question, I believe that's to Tabitha. It's a little bit sensitive, I think. Let me see, give me 1 second. I lost it. Okay, it's talking about what impact if the US DOJ China initiative have on hampering coordination between American and Chinese scientists engaged in climate-related research. Tabitha?
Yep. So it's a great question. And so in general, the more technical the field was, the higher sensitivity it was for the US government under that initiative. And, so if you're, there's this one story of someone who from China wanted to come to the States to study fish genetics. And instead of putting down that they were a fishery scientist, they put down that they were a geneticist. And if they, I mean, genetics is a lot more sensitive in terms of the STEM field, for some of the suspicions that motivated that initiative, as opposed to, fishery science is a little less sensitive. So, the initiatives that had, more of like a kind of environmental policy focus were less sensitive, and anything that was, kind of a part of climate science that could have, a dual purpose use, essentially, like anything that was kind of like highly technical, engineering intensive, something like that. So I don't, it's just been lifted recently. So I don't think we've really seen what's going to happen yet. It's still too early to tell. But I think really the challenge now is, the pandemic, and that is, I mean, it's just really stopped any kind of, there's still only very limited exchanges between the US and China right now, especially because, China still has a pretty long quarantine period. So it makes it harder to do smaller trips. I think for people who are going over to China to study, it's maybe a little more feasible, but it's really hard to say how that's going to end. But yeah, fingers crossed that things will get better on all fronts. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Tabitha. I think the next question is to Dr. Furukawa. Well, some argue that marine protected areas have been used by countries in contested waters, in disputed waters, as a way to laying them claims, particularly when they're in transboundary. Do you believe there is a realistic way for transboundary marine protected areas to establish a way to shovel the territorial disputes?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for letting me to answer this question. I love to do that. Because of the other Professor Hanich mentioned that if we stand on the eye of the fish or another species living in the underwater, they not understood that there is a border between some area to the other area to be circulating around or swimming around. So the answer, very, very short answer is yes for me, because of my optimism. I mean that if we're thinking about the asset like biodiversity or blue carbon efficiency, if we thinking this kind of asset is not belong to each nation, but this is a worldwide asset to be protected by the MPA. In that case, yes, we are thinking that the marine protected area can be one of the tools to making the harmonization of the setting the MPA between the border or across the border because of the nature of the water circulation and of the ocean. Yes, this is a short answer from my optimistic view, and back to you, Dr. Hong.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think Dr. Chen Li has a question on China's blue carbon. So the question is, China's blue carbon policy has largely focused on coastal areas, as is seen in the 2020-2025 action plan for mangrove protection and restoration. So the question is, what is unique about China's approach and what lesson can be learned from it? Do you expect any development or changes in the approach in 2025?
Yeah, thank you. Also, thank you for great questions. I think China's mangrove preservation plan is more focused on its ecological value, and so the basic target or basic aim is to preserve those natural resources. So that's caused sort of conflicts with livelihoods for the local people. I think now. During the existing plan, our government actually spent lots of public finance to support those kind of preservation programs. And for the next station, we'd like to propose, so first to broaden the scope of those project, so we can invite stakeholders from inland province, and they can invest, or they can got benefit from those capital markets. So that would be more visible for those mangrove forest resource, and it should not be just devoting time or efforts by government, by NGOs. I think it could be it should designed as a renewable or a continuable mechanisms. Yeah, and include more stakeholders. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. I'm going to give the last question to Professor Wang Sheng. I think the question is related to your earlier remark on China-ASEAN cooperation. What made the creative regime be established between China and ASEAN states and other surrounding states to cooperate from climate change response, by the way, blue carbon management? This question from Professor Wang Jiayu from Nankai University. Professor Wang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That is a very good question. And thank you all for all your creative ideas and suggestions for the cooperation. Yes, I think one of the goals of this event today is to connect the world by our efforts, especially the efforts of ICAS. And I think there are many things we can do in the near future, especially concerning China, Southeast Asian countries cooperation. I think we could start on cooperation in the areas of blue carbon, including environmentally friendly and pollution-free aquaculture technology and traditional fishery to carbon sink fishery area. This is one area. The other area, of course, is on marine new energy. For example, we could make efforts for cooperation offshore wind power, ocean and thermal energy, ocean wave power and ocean tide power to build a system of blue energy. And we could discuss to establish a mechanism in this particular area. And of course, we could consider to build a global blue carbon market mechanism. We could start maybe by China and ASEAN countries first, and enhance our carbon market bargaining power through the use of our blue carbon resources between China and ASEAN countries. So I think there are many things we can think about, and we could start in some earlier stage, in some easier area to difficult areas. So I suggest that we could establish a forum, for example, for international blue carbon exchange and cooperation in the very beginning, so that we can collect ideas and suggestions, from all over the world, in this particular area. And that is my simple answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang, Professor Wang Sheng, for your remark. And I would like to thank all our speakers for spending your time with us. And I thank you very much for taking our invitation to attend our first online event of our new program. And I also want to thank our participants online from China and in the morning, and also from the US, which is pretty late for spending time with us today. And we still have a lot of questions in the Q&A. We don't have time to address all of them, but we'll make sure that we are going to release this program online, and then we're going to write a summary and to share with you. And also, I'm happy to announce that ICAS will release our first blue carbon and climate change quarterly in a couple of days by the end of this month. So this quarterly will record the most important trends and developments regarding blue carbon policies and regulations in China and the US, and also other countries in other regions, as well as other international regimes. So we're really looking forward to working closely with you for more research outcome on blue carbon climate change. Well, thank you again for participating in today's event.